Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Mavid Vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We are continuing our reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, one of the 16 disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. And we're going to be reading a little bit about education. So I thought we could start with a song that was written many years ago with the idea that if we ever had a Vedanta school in America, we would need a school anthem. So this would be this possible school anthem. And the lyrics go like this. Hail to the goddess of learning, art, and song. We pray you grant us good hearts and voices strong. By your grace will flower our creative power, and through your will divine perfection within us is manifested. Hail to the goddess, all hail to thee. All dressed in white, how radiant is your face, embodiment of purity and grace. We strive through learning to have thoughts inspiring, and by your grace descending sweetly, we will reach our goals completely. Hail to the goddess, all hail to thee. Pure Sattvaguna, the power that reveals, that part of Maya that does not much conceal. Consort of Brahma, you're the bringer of all arts. O knowledge, learning, music, beauty, you're our mother Saraswati. Hail to the goddess, all hail to thee. Anybody out there that needs a school anthem, you're welcome to borrow that one. All right, so let's see what Swami Ramakrishnananda has in store for us tonight. Modern education as it holds in India. Now, of course, this will now be 100 years old, so not quite as modern as it might have been when he wrote it, but I'm sure he will still have some interesting things to say. So, Atma, if you begin.
The system of education, which is now in vogue in our schools and colleges, in its own way, no doubt, very good. But it should be supplemented a little bit by an education which will make our boys morally and spiritually more strong. The influence of this materialistic age has permeated almost all of our modern books with which we educate our boys. Positivism is the only theme of science and philosophy, and sense perceptions are their only standards of judgment. The world is the only thing to be studied, doted upon, and embraced with all one's might. What cannot be sensed must be given up as chimerical, fanciful, and perfectly useless. This is what the students mostly learns in our schools and colleges. And what is the result of such an education? He's lost all faith and all regard and reverence for the eternal being who disposes and arranges every cosmic particle, which thus moved, creates, preserves, and destroys the universe in infinite space and time. He does not believe that he existed previous to his birth and is to exist after the dissolution of his body. This narrow span of life is all in all to him, which in his imagination he regards as permanent, and thus all his hopes, all his aspirations are confined to it only. His fond attachment to life makes him forget its ephemeral nature, and he goes on building innumerable baseless castles in the air and dreams of himself as the undisputed lord of all of them. Alas, sooner or later to be suddenly awakened to the grim fact that his career has almost come to an end. If education means expansion of mind by knowledge, can we call that education which instead of expanding, narrows and confines the individual to this precarious and transient duration which goes by the name of human life? The Vedas declare that which is infinitely expanded on all sides is alone blissful. Bliss cannot be found in narrow and limited things. The infinite alone is bliss. One should desire to comprehend the infinite. The hoary sages of old India knew what was true education. Thus educating themselves, they came to know that the self alone is below, the self above, the self behind, the self before, the self is on the right, the self is on the left. The self alone is all this. Can death frighten him who thus expands or educates himself? This is what is real education. If education, instead of broadening one's soul and gradually enabling it to embrace even the infinite, narrows and coops it up in the not very pleasant hole of a momentary life, it's worse than ignorance. And the wise man who first entered the settlement, where ignorance is bliss, it is folly to be wise, had perhaps in his mind this kind of education.
Yes, so of course in this country we all have a history of having parochial schools as in addition to the public schools where you can at least teach religion. I went to a parochial school for 6 years. It was Episcopalian, and we began every morning with a chapel service. So every morning you had a little bit of talk about religion, and we sang hymns and so forth. And so that sort of sets the mood for the day. My sister taught in Catholic schools most of her life, and again, she got to teach religion classes. The students were required to do that. I went to a college that had been founded by the Presbyterians. It was no longer affiliated with them, but there was still a requirement to take some sort of religion class. And so I took Bible literature, and unfortunately the professor wasn't terribly religious himself. He'd sort of studied the Bible to death and then kind of lost his faith from all the studies, which I thought was rather a sad commentary. But interestingly enough, one of our nuns was also in my class at the same college, and she took world religions, and that world religions class came here every year for a visit. And then she ended up being introduced to Vedanta and becoming a nun. So it's nice when colleges recognize the value of religions and allow people to take courses in it. Of course, our schools in India always emphasize this type of moral education and character building. That's the foundation of our schools in India. And they're highly sought after. The competition to get in some of the Ramakrishna order schools is quite competitive. So this kind of education is really the foundation of what Swami Ramakrishnananda is speaking of. And when you think of it, you can see how you could approach all your subject matters with a Vedantic idea in mind. You could look at the holism, look for the oneness. You know, all of these subjects begin to boil down to looking for the oneness in things. We tend to categorize things and break things down, but then we have to look for the wholeness and the patterns and the connections between them. And we find that we get a bigger understanding from a subject when we look at the wholeness and the patterns. And so there's an element of Vedantic theory there, that we have to look for the wholeness, because everything really is interconnected and everything has oneness for its basis. And then, of course, you can look at music and art as expressions of divinity, and how each of those arts can be used as a way to enhance one's spiritual experience. And you can go on and on like this. Each subject could be thought like that. You could look at history from the standpoint of the pursuit of peace, love, and freedom, and how those three desires, which is really just the unchanging, peace is the unchanging, love is the undivided, and freedom is the infinite. Those three yearnings are what drive the world. But of course, the reason they drive the world is that our true nature is the infinite, undivided, and unchanging. But we don't see it that way, so we keep trying to find it in the world. And so that's a very interesting way to approach things like history and literature, to see how those three desires function in our lives. And of course, then that motivates you to realize that the real thing that you're looking for is the infinite, undivided, unchanging, the existence, consciousness, bliss that is Brahman and your true nature. All right, let's continue with this next paragraph. Yeah. Okay.
Where ignorance is bliss, it's folly to be wise, had perhaps in his mind this kind of education. And is not our modern education something like this? Oh, you may say that our boys have nowadays become more broad-hearted and liberal. They've almost demolished the narrowing walls of the caste system and begun to mix more freely with their neighbors than their forefathers had done. Nowadays, most of them do not observe that foolish restriction in food and take all those nourishing viands which are sanctioned by the unerring decision of science. They do not like to confine themselves to their own country, thinking it to be all in all, like the frog in the well. They want to go out to other lands to learn many new things, and thus gather more knowledge which their own country is inadequate to supply them with. Did any ancient society or nation know what great power of doing good to the world lay dormant in steam or electricity? Modern scientific education, flying under two wings of observation and experiment, has soared to those regions which our forefathers could not even imagine, and discovered those grand truths which to them appeared as incredible as miracles. Considering all these glorious achievements, can we judiciously stigmatize our present system of education as narrow and worthless?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking also how in earlier days the reading material for elementary school would contain stories that would be something like Aesop's Fables or the Jataka Tales of Buddhism. They were, the ones that I can remember were called the McGuffey readers. And my grandfather used to quote McGuffey's readers if he thought a particular aphorism or truth that was illustrated in one of the stories. He'd say, oh, that's like so-and-so, McGuffey's reader number 3. And he'd remember all of these little stories that were inspiring to him. And unfortunately, by the time I got to school, we were raised on an inane set of reading books that dealt with Dick and Jane and their dog Spot. Look and see Jane. Oh my goodness, it was dull. So we certainly went backwards in that area from his day to mine. I don't know what they're using now, however. All right, let's go on.
Yes, I do not deny that some good we have derived from our education, but I'm not ready to give it more credit than what is really due to it. All those glorious achievements which you have just now pointed out are almost nothing better than so many shining soap bubbles, which are very glorious to look at, but contain nothing inside. Our boys have certainly become more broad-hearted and liberal. They're very lax in observing the caste restrictions nowadays. But is it really a fact? Have they really become so much filled with the love for all beings that they can equally feel for all, a saint as well as a sinner, a beautiful as well as an ugly man, a rich as well as a poor neighbor, a friend as well as an enemy? Have they realized the highest ideal which Bhagavan Sri Krishna holds out in his immortal song divine, describing the state of those men who have been really able to demolish the narrowing walls of the caste system, as the truly wise look equally towards a learned and humble brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, a pariah? Have they been able to garner in their bosoms that universal solvent of divine love, wherein good, bad, high, low, rich, poor, favorable, unfavorable, all become one? Can they look towards their enemy with the same eye where they see their friends? Has not education made them more vain, more negligent towards their inferiors, more fastidious, more critical in finding fault with others, more lenient and indulgent regarding their own shortcomings, and as such more selfish than their uneducated brethren? Considering this, can we say with any good reason that they've almost demolished the narrowing walls of the caste system? Have they not jumped from the frying pan into the fire by giving up one kind of caste system and taking up another? Has the change made them better or worse? The born Brahmana does not hate his inferiors so much as the reform-loving revolutionist hates those who are conservatively disposed. Is this love? I'm not discussing here about the merits or demerits of the caste system as it now holds in India. What I want to show is that the so-called reform brought about by our modern education has not mended matters in any way, but has perhaps spoiled them in many cases.
Yes, perhaps it's an unfortunate characteristic of human nature for us to tend to compartmentalize people in different ways, and in order to make ourselves feel better, tend to see all the faults in others. And so we glorify our particular group of people and our particular people that we tend to mix with and identify with, and sort of belittle what other groups are doing. And so that tends to boost the ego. Now, of course, our main spiritual problem is the ego. So if you're really on the spiritual path, you're trying to reduce your ego and to get rid of your ego. So you have to look at the broader picture. Another thing that this was reminding me of is that all of the things that he was mentioning about the things that were seen as potentially good about modern education and yet turned out to actually have some negatives. it has to do with those green glasses that we talked about a few readings ago, where if you put on green glasses, everything looks green. So if you put on your Vedantic glasses, your Advaitic glasses, your oneness glasses, and look for the oneness in things, then you will see the oneness in things. If you look for the differences, you'll see the differences. And so it's important for that basic spiritual education to teach people to have that eye of wisdom in looking at the nature of the world. And also to help them spiritualize whatever kind of career they go into. So people can't spend their entire waking life in meditation and scripture reading and devotional practices. People have to make a living. So you have to educate them. How do you go about your work and keep reminding yourself of the divinity in all things? What's the nature of your work, and how can you turn the nature of your work into something which reminds you constantly of the oneness of all beings and the oneness of all creation, the fact that everything is coming from that oneness. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. There was a very interesting teaching course on the nature of the universe. What was the title of it? Now I've forgotten. But anyway, it was interesting. He went through all the sciences from all the different ages, from ancient times to modern times, every possible branch of science you could think of, including physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology. And he showed that what they tended to do was first break things down into little bits. And then they realized that they were missing some things and not understanding things completely. So then they looked for ways of connecting the different systems that they had broken things into. And then they looked at greater and greater interrelationships between them. And eventually they were beginning to look at a kind of wholeness. They were looking for the basic oneness that underlied the whole discipline. So if you looked at all of your scientific disciplines that way, you see, that would be looking at them through these Advaitic glasses, where you study it and you learn all the details, but then you realize that this is illustrating that there's an involution and an evolution, and that all that we see in this universe is an evolution of the oneness that is involved in it to begin with. It has to be in there to begin with to manifest. And so all of these studies remind you of that rather than just getting lost in the details. Okay, let's go on.
The next thing our education has done is that it has saved our young men from becoming frogs in the well by taking some of them to foreign countries to learn many new truths which they could not learn in India. Thanks to the British government, whose broad and philanthropic line of action has spared no pains to bring in the light of Western science and philosophy to illumine this subject empire. The liberal education received in our schools and colleges produces men who are not in any way inferior to any of those England return title holders in points of up-to-date scientific and literary attainments. The former have got greater caution and judgment in them than their more civilized brethren, who are characterized by hasty and superficial methods of procedure. And all their attempts to put new wine in old bottles is that of thrusting Western manners and customs into our Eastern modes of living. Almost all the noteworthy children of modern education, beginning from Rajaram Mohanam Roy, who've done any real good to India, at first completed their scholarship here, and then some of them went to the West and were recognized as learned scholars. In the face of such facts, it is useless to argue that we must go out of our motherland in order to attain perfection. As to the unbounded license in taking food of all descriptions from all sources, which our education has given us, we cannot be much proud of it, in consideration of the fact that it's more difficult and more noble to restrain one's passions and appetites than giving them unrestrained liberty. Most of our educated men nowadays harbor a wrong notion that animal food can give us more physical and mental vigor than vegetable diet, in spite of the fact that all the brahmanas are vegetarians from their birth, although from time immemorial their families have never soiled their hands and tainted their minds with the blood of living beings who love life as much as any one of us. If not more, yet they are more intelligent and educated than their flesh-eating brethren, fairer and more beautiful, sober and more considerate in many cases. This is especially true of the Deccan, which has given India 3 of her best religious teachers, Sri Shankara, Sri Ramanuja, and Sri Madhava, all of whom were brahmanas. Food indeed should be taken according to one's natural craving, caused by the climate in which one lives, as well as by one's mental aptitude, which may be either thoughtful, active, or dull. The thoughtful man naturally likes food which is plain, simple, and easily digestible. An active man requires life-giving and exciting food to hold him up in his incessant struggles against unfavorable circumstances. It's only a lazy, dull, and worthless man, having no discriminative fatuity, that takes all sorts of food without any restriction, his idea being to swallow as much victuals as possible. And alas, the number of such people is legion. It is not at all good to take food from a man whom one knows to be immoral and wicked, because by so doing one will have to sympathize with him in gratefulness, which is as good as imbibing his perverse nature to some extent. So it is not at all good to be indiscriminate in taking one's food, as such a laxity greatly tends to bring down the man. We cannot be at all proud of our young man's unrestrained license in the matter of messing. The food which does not suit a man's constitution is unhealthy to him, and therefore he should avoid it if he wants to live long with health and vigor. In the beginning of the formation of one's character, restriction is absolutely necessary, as it acts like a hedge around a growing plant, says Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna. If a plant is not protected by a fence, it is beset with all sorts of dangers. It is sure to fall a victim to 1,001 of them. But when it grows up to be a tree, the fence may be removed without doing any injury to it. Similarly, when a man has his character firmly implanted in him, let him therein go beyond caste and food restrictions. That will not injure him in any way. Previous to that, if he gives undue license to himself, it will be as good as forcibly pulling out the slough from above a sore, which is not completely healed, and thus making it worse. If a frog wants to be as big as a bull, in its attempt to do so, it will burst itself out to death. Similarly, if a man with unformed character wants to imitate a man with formed character, he will fare nothing better than the frog.
Well, of course, he's going into all sorts of areas here, and one could argue in several ways here, but certainly it's important in character development to have certain restrictions, but again, they have to be suited to the particular people in a particular time and place. So those things need to be incorporated in upbringing of people. But of course, we usually leave that to the parents. But unfortunately, sometimes the parents are not as active in the child's upbringing as would be ideal, and that's become more of a problem in recent times, because it's very common for both the wife and the husband to have to hold jobs in order to make enough money to support the family. So that leaves them less time to bring up the children, and less time for them to guide their children in their character building. So that's one of the dilemmas, is we don't want the schools to dictate what their belief systems will be, but the parents don't have the time to do it either. So then we want the schools to give them some sort of character building education, but then you end up with the debate of what kind of character building education. So it becomes a debate as to how you can balance those things, which of course is current in some of our school districts today, is to how to manage the education of the children. And some people want to liberalize people's views, and other people want them to be inculcated with some of the more traditional values, which other people feel are less appropriate for this time and age. So the debate goes on. All right, well, let's continue here.
Now let us consider the nature of our education, which nowadays principally rests upon the study of the science, whose sweet harmony and precise character have been lately discovered by our modern savants, and thus whose youthful beauty, coupled with their various marvelous achievements, has an irresistible charm over the whole humanity. Our poetry, drama, history, philosophy, nay, the whole range of literature have been permeated with their light. Even religion, herself fearing that her antique beauty may not be a match to the youthful charms of this newly found maid, has begun to court her favor and sit at her feet to learn about the proper method of procedure that will gain more customers for her old self. How this young governess of the old lady has tortured and twisted many of her antiquated notions is not unknown to most of us. So science nowadays is all paramount, and in judging her beauty, I'm virtually judging the whole modern age, which has got all its charms from her.
Of course, we're talking about India 100 years ago, but even when I was going to school, we had what we call the Sputnik generation. After the Russians launched Sputnik and the U.S. felt very behind in scientific achievements, there was this push that if we needed more scientists, we needed more mathematicians, we needed to catch up in the race, so that there was a great emphasis in the sciences. And of course, that was wonderful for people that had those kinds of propensities, but if you weren't particularly interested in the sciences, sometimes people were kind of forced into areas that were not their expertise, and then that made it difficult, and then they can begin to feel inferior because they can't keep up with their classmates in these more specialized subjects. So even in our modern USA, we've had these kinds of problems. And it's sad is that frequently when budgets are cut, the things that are cut are things like music, art, and even sometimes athletics, although that tends to get more favor from most people than music and art. And so and drama. The support of those kinds of enterprises in school is unfortunately the first thing that tends to get cut when money is short. But those are things that nurture the souls of people, and sometimes those are the things that certain people are good at, and they get a lot more out of school if they have at least a couple of subjects that they're really interested in and can feel successful in. So it's very important that we keep some of those subjects in our schools and give them support. A lot of those things involve after-school activities as well. And many times people that are, say, the drama teacher or the music teacher that's working with the drama teacher to put on a show for to give the students experience as putting on a musical show or something. Those people have to work long hours after school, and they get almost no extra compensation, if any. I remember the drama teacher at the school where I worked for a while said she got about 50 cents an hour for the extra work that she did. So we really need to be able to support those people. And of course, it also depends on teaching those subjects in a way that's conducive to the character building of the students. Otherwise, it loses some of its value. All right, let's go on with what he's saying here.
Observation and experiment are the two principal methods with which science starts confidently being fully convinced beforehand about the uniformity of natural laws. Reasoning is the soul of these two methods, which in its turn is based upon the duality of the knower and the known, the subject and the object, the Purusha and the Prakriti. If it is a fact that the subject can live independent of the object, if it is not the case that the subject is a mere bundle of various ideas, which are the various representation of the object, it's also a fact that the object can live as well independent of the subject. The subject which lives independent of the object goes by the name of Purusha, or mind in itself. And the object which lives independent of the subject goes by the name of Prakriti, or matter in itself. Let us try to have some sort of conception of these two independent entities. Mind in itself, being free from all material taints, must be beyond thinking and feeling, based upon desire or will, and hence must be unknown and unknowable in itself, having the power to know when it comes in contact with the object. Matter in itself, not being known to the subject, is also unknown and unknowable in itself, having the power to be known by the subject coming in contact with it. So when neither of these two comes in contact with each other, when each is left perfectly free to itself, the subject, being void of all desires, all activities, is regarded as perfect, since desire means want, which means imperfection.
Okay, so we have to remember that he's now speaking from the standpoint of the Sankhya philosophy, which is the dualistic idea of these two independent realities. But if you're coming from an Advaitic perspective, then you realize that the subject and object have emerged simultaneously from the one. Brahman is the one, and it, out of play, decides to know itself through manifesting in a duality of subject and object. And then the creation goes on from there. But from that standpoint, you realize that both are coming from the one, that there aren't two separate realities, but there are really one. But here we're starting with Sankhya philosophy, which starts with these two independent principles. So there's a difference here, but this is very frequent. We often take a standpoint from one philosophy or another, depending on the particular topic that we're talking about, and he's chosen to start with the Sankhya ideas here. All right, let's continue.
Yeah, because everyone wants to be perfect, and none wants to be imperfect. It follows that the final separation of the subject from the object constitutes the highest goal of men and gods alike. This is what is called liberation or mukti, realizing which the man is not conditioned by or confined to any desire, and thus unconfined he becomes infinite, or realizes his infinite nature. Being beyond all activities, he realizes his eternal, changeless nature, and free from all restlessness, causing worries and anxieties, he realizes his all-blissful state. This eternally all-blissful and conscious nature of man goes by the name of Satchidananda. This is indeed the only goal which all beings are struggling to reach. This is the only idea of every man, ideal of every man, for does not everyone love to live eternally? What can be more hateful to him than the idea of death? Does he not want to be always happy? Not misery a thing which he hates most? Is there not in him an incessant hankering after knowledge? And can that hankering in him ever cease, as long as there will remain something more for him to be known? His hunger after knowledge has no limit. and it will never be satiated until he knows all. Then alone his restlessness will end. Now, as long as a man is restless, he is not in his proper element, reaching which alone he finds absolute rest. Hence, man's real element or nature is omniscience, for nothing short of that will ever give him rest. Thus, we have found out true human nature, which is eternal, all blissful, and omniscient. Can he ever expect to realize this as long as he will remain connected with this universe? The knower of Purusha has to entirely separate himself from the known of Prakriti before he's able to realize his infinite nature, as we have just now seen. The goal lies in this final separation, which means the destruction of this idea of a universe of sense. For what is this universe? It is offspring of the union of Prakrusha with Prakriti, of the knower with the known, of the subject with the object. It is altogether a dependent thing. It is made up of forms, touches, tastes, smells, and sounds, and thus it's based upon a conscious living organism, and consequently is as evanescent and shifting as the latter. It's a series of ever-changing appearances, which mirage-like always eludes the grasp of the most acute of observers, and that's why it is known as phenomenon, as opposed to noumenon, or the permanent background, upon which it manifests itself like the shadowy picture of the magic lantern. Thus it is nothing better than a passing shadow, and should always regard it as such. This is the conclusion which we at last arrive at after properly analyzing the universe. Could he be regarded as a wise man who makes much of this shadow?
Well, we will have to stay tuned till next week for the answer to that question. Well, we got a minute. Let's read the next paragraph. Maybe it'll give us the answer. But it just reminds me of the Vivekananda would say, know that which by all things you know all, by which you would know all things, which of course is to know Brahman. If you know Brahman, then you will know all things, and so you're not hankering after any specific knowledge after that, because from the knowledge of Brahman flows the knowledge of everything. All right, so let's see what he says this next paragraph, and then we'll conclude.
The subject matter of science is this universe alone, which regards as the only reality. She does not want to admit the existence of anything which is not to be found in it. She teaches us to worship it and it alone, to make it the only subject of our study, setting aside all such transcendental ideas as that of God, Purusha, Prakriti. She wants to convince us that this earth is all in all. Hence, she is ever vigilant to beautify and adorn it, and make it so charming, attractive, and homelike that men may not have any inclination to search for any other home anywhere. She holds that knowledge is power, knowledge gathered from observation and experiment.
Of course, the science of Raja Yoga is the science of gaining knowledge through observation and experience of yourself, going within rather than without. So it's a similar process, but you've turned the process inward rather than outward. And by that process, you can come to know Brahman, which is the basis of everything, and by which you would know all things. All right, let's conclude there, and we'll continue next week. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.